So hello, everyone, and welcome to CGS Book Club. Today is Saturday, the 29th of March, our second book club this month, so a real treat. My name is James May. I'm a Senior Program Officer at CGS, and I'm your moderator for today's book club. I'm pleased to see everyone here. We've got a good turnout. Welcome all. We're recording today's session. The video will be made available on YouTube in due course. If this is your first time at book club and you would like to be kept informed about the upcoming book club sessions, please drop a message in the chat with your email address and we'll add you to the mailing list. Today is our first session on World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century, second edition, by Andreas Bummel and Joe Leinen. Andreas joins us today. Andreas, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Book Club. For reference, should anybody wish to, the digital version of the book is available for purchase on the Democracy Without Borders website, which I will drop in the chat now. So before I introduce Andreas more thoroughly, I will take us through housekeeping, as usual. I'm sure the subject of today's book is one that is close to all of our hearts, and many of you will have questions and comments. To ensure everyone gets a chance to join in, I will ask everyone to keep their questions or comments to just 2 minutes. If you exceed that time, I will interject and ask you to wrap up so everyone has an opportunity to speak. Once everybody who would like to have the opportunity to comment or ask questions has done so, I will open the floor for further discussion with a second round of questions and comments. Does anyone have an objection to our community agreement for the Q&A? No? Wonderful. Thank you. You can raise your hands virtually or physically, or you can put questions in the chat. I'll come to you on a first come, first served basis, and we'll rotate from there. We'll stop about 10 minutes before the end of the session at around 1:20 for any announcements people may wish to make about relevant events or things they want to promote. Please therefore hold on to any comments you may have that are not related to book club until the end, or you can put them in the chat at any time. With housekeeping out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce Andreas Bummel. Andreas is the founder and executive director of Democracy Without Borders. He's a leading campaigner for the creation of a parliamentary assembly at the UN, which has garnered the support of over 1,500 parliamentarians in over 100 countries. Andreas is also one of the co-conveners of the We the People's campaign, which advocates for a more democratic UN, and has been active in the campaign calling for the appointment of a UN Special Rapporteur on Democracy. Andreas was a member of the Council of the World Federalist Movement from 1998 to 2018. The first edition of World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century was published in 2018. The second edition, published last year, updates and expands on the first edition. With all that said, it is now my pleasure to hand over to Andreas. Andreas, would you like to take us away with your introduction?
Thank you very much, James, for this kind introduction, and to CGS, Rebecca, for the invitation to present today at this book club session. It's a delight also to see many familiar faces and colleagues and friends I've been working with for a long time, and to see some real specialists here who I am sure will be able to enrich the discussion with questions and comments. My understanding is that we will examine one chapter in particular of the book A World Parliament, which is chapter 27. Of course, I will talk more about that, and also that there was some optional reading which concerns chapter 5. But of course, before we jump and zoom in into these two chapters, I think it would be good still to share a few general reflections on the book, if that is okay, and perhaps starting with the second edition. As James, you said, the first edition appeared in 2018. It was actually at the time a translation of the German book that appeared a year earlier with a German publisher. And we had that German edition translated by somebody else, right? And well, at the time, we did not have the capacity to go through it line by line. So that's what was done now for the second edition. And I believe that for this reason, the second edition also includes some linguistic improvements and terminology improvements and many such things at the level of detail. But also the second edition is expanded by 1/5. It includes a lot of new material across the book. The book has 3 parts, as you know. Of course, this is a book club. I assume you have all read it, of course, at very least the 2 chapters in question today. So you know a lot of what I will be telling you, namely that the book has 3 parts. One is about the history of the idea of cosmopolitanism and then of the world parliament. The second part goes through many subject areas to underline the relevance of this general idea of a global parliament, which is, of course, connected to a global transformation of the international order into a democratic world federation. And the third part, of which chapter 27, to which it belongs, chapter 27, is about questions of implementation primarily. So throughout all of these parts, there are now in the second edition new elements, new subsections, and a few sections have been completely rewritten. In the first part, I mean, that is something that I really enjoy doing. We, researched more to have a broader approach towards the idea of cosmopolitanism across the world regions. So we are also, for instance, looking now in a short subsection into the indigenous concepts of Ubuntu or Benvivir in the Latin American region and other things, cosmopolitanism in medieval Baghdad, etc. So there is a broader picture here now, and you can also find that across the book included where possible. But of course, the question of global political integration, world federalism, and the world parliament in particular has gained different levels of attention in different time spans in different regions. We have made all effort to dig out practically all sources and references to a world parliament possible throughout, history. And we actually included everything we found. It was not possible, though, to contextualize everything, right? And some sources might still be missing here and there, but I'm pretty optimistic that after this, 10 years of work, we might have found quite everything, and also identified references that were not correct. Like there was one reference in the literature on the Bandung conference, which I will mention again in a minute, that the World Parliament was discussed there. That is not true, right? Anyway, so it is a reference work also, and I know that for many it is not easy to read. Historians will enjoy it, scientists will enjoy it, but it's probably not a book that we would use to address a general audience. It's very dense, but for those who work in this field, I think it's a good resource. I hope so, at least. And that's maybe enough as a general introduction. I'm not sure whether I should elaborate on the idea of a world parliament in general. I think that the idea here is that we would really jump into those 2 chapters, right? And then have time to look at these in detail. Of course, the chapter 27 that is of particular interest today is embedded into the overall rationale and narrative of the book, which I will not talk about, right? It is rather technical. It is the first chapter in the third part, which concerns the implementation of a world parliament as part of a transformation of the global political order, which we put into the context of democratic development. You know, in the literature and political science, there is the idea of several waves of democratization. We are now witnessing perhaps the end of the third wave of democratization, and we are in a wave of autocratization. Such waves and cycles have existed in the past, and those are connected for sure also to the prospects and the idea of global democracy in the sense of democratization at the global scale. So these waves and transformations, the second transformation then in political science is viewed as the implementation of democratic principles at the level of nation state, of larger territorial states. And there is the idea in the literature of the third transformation where democracy would go beyond the nation state, right? And this is the general setting, certainly, of this book. How does this third transformation of democracy unfold? How does it look like? And we argue certainly that a democratically elected legislative body, in other words, a world parliament, is the key vehicle and also output, expected output, and a necessary output of this transformation. We are also making the point that this second transformation, which is connected to those waves, it is not complete, is connected to the third transformation. So I'm just describing the overall context of this chapter 25 before we zoom in. And of course, from our point of view, the problem is that the success of these two transformations, they are interlinked now because we have a process of interdependence, of globalization, of shared challenges on a planetary scale, new planetary boundaries that we have identified in the Earth system, the atmosphere, for instance, and climate change being relevant here, the boundary being, CO2 and carbon emission concentration, etc. So the problem is that these two transformations, they are now interlinked. The success of democracy at the nation state level is linked to the success of democracy at the global scale, and vice versa. Both will succeed or fail together, in my opinion, and that is reflected in the book. So the big challenge is in all of this, how do we globalize our democratic experience and learning in a useful way? And for this, in center stage, there is the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly, which is to be looked at as a process. The World Parliament, as we outline it in the book, finally, it all culminates then in the third part. In the other two parts, we are looking at different models and ideas throughout history and at present, how that has been envisaged. It is more reference work. We have tried to find sources and people and literature through which we could express our own ideas and to put them on record. So a lot of it is really descriptive and not analytical because we are pulling together everything that could be found in terms of commentary and analysis in this regard. Well, and if we look at it as a process, the Parliamentary Assembly is a starting point that would develop into a second chamber of the World Parliament, being envisaged as a two-chamber system. And perhaps now I really can start talking about chapter 5, which was optional reading, just a few reflections. I understand not too much detail. Chapter 5 is really the post-World War II situation, more generally, politically speaking, in terms of the prospects and discussions related to world federalism and the United Nations, its formation. Of course, there's not a clear-cut let's say, boundary between the time of the war and the post-World War era. It somehow glues together. But what is important, I think, from today's perspective, and that's also a little bit of a new element that I included in the second edition, that is to see that in the year time from, let's say, 1941 to 1950, it was not for all who were involved in these discussions and actually in the fight of decolonization, etc., a given that the UN, from their perspective, should be based on a system of sovereign nation states, separate states. And I think that's important because from us, in present generations, if we look back, it seems like everything that we witness historically, it seems like a given. We don't necessarily realize that at those times that was not the case necessarily. The future was open. It was not clear in 1941 how the post-World War order would look like. And there were, in fact, different ideas. It is only a hindsight from today's perspective that we think, of course, everything had to automatically develop as it did. But a good example to show that there are those, situations that are quite fluid is that the, people in the colonies at that time, they were envisioning a different kind of development. Not that necessarily the countries they were living in would go through a process of decolonization that would result in a separate sovereign state, but there were very strong ideas of federation at the regional scale and internationally. For instance, Leopold Senghor, who was a world federalist, he was promoting the idea of a political integration of the Francophonie, West Africa and the metropole in France, with a common citizenship and a common parliament. And the idea that Senegal and other countries would become automatically sovereign and separate member states of the UN, in that thinking was not a given. That has only developed later because that was pushed by the founders of the UN, including the US and so on. And that was not pushed at that time necessarily from the periphery, what we would call periphery, I guess, in world system theory, etc. But another example for this is quite clearly Nehru and Indian independence. That's also a few paragraphs in the book about this, who were promoting Commonwealth citizenship. The British Commonwealth. There was the Round Table Group. That is some chapters before that. That was Leinen Curtis, and starting with Cecil Rhodes, who were promoting that the British Commonwealth should actually transform also into a international Anglophone federation with a common parliament also. That, of course, did not happen. But this idea somewhat re-emerged in the context of Indian independence, and that's quite interesting, I think, to take note. And there's another chapter that is shortly in the historic part, touching also on the time of the French Revolution, which was a similar interesting situation where it was not a given that the revolution in France and at that time and elsewhere would automatically mean that this is about establishing and forming a French Republic that is completely separate, because there were revolutionaries like Anacletus Clotes who were promoting that there would actually be like a worldwide revolution starting from France, but of a cosmopolitan character, where those monarchies and feudal territories that would be toppled and become democratic, they would actually all join one by one an ever-growing universal republic. Of course, that, as it was the case around during the Second World War, that was only a few years, and then it was done. But I'm just saying there are those phases in history where it's not clear what's going to happen in the future. Only at hindsight you think it is a given, and that is not reflected a bit in chapter 5 now in the new second edition. That's an element that was not so clearly expressed in the original edition, and this concerns the whole process of decolonization a bit, you know. And I think it's an important reference point even today, to say that this idea of national sovereignty, that was not automatically the idea behind decolonization. In terms of chapter 5, there's a lot, of course, to be said. Maybe one more point, which I think has a little bit of a relevance even today. I mean, a general remark would be certainly that it is, you know, working on this subject and the book, it is quite amazing and also a bit sobering that many of the relevant discussions have not moved on in 2 centuries. They have been around for a long time. You know, like how should such a World Congress and Parliament look like, and what to do about the large countries that have the largest share of population. Those are discussions that have happened already in the 19th century as they do today, and there has not been much intellectual advancement, unfortunately, in the literature on any of it. So I think that's a bit sobering. To say that, and one of these issues is really that's, you know, coming up again in repeat cycles without much intellectual advancement. That's this idea of a community of democracies, an alliance of democracies that was already in the 30s put forward by Clarence Stride. I'm touching on that a bit in this chapter 5 as well. Of course, at that time in a World War situation, it was quite obvious, I think, to imagine that there would be such club is not strong enough, such an alliance, a community of democratic states that would integrate to join forces to create synergies in their fight against the Axis powers at the time. And then the idea, okay, after the war, we are, you know, striving towards a universal organization, but in an environment where there are still autocracies. Or even more, I mean, there was the totalitarian Stalinist Soviet Union, and it was quite clear to the governments already, if not the public at large, that Stalinism, you know, was a terrorist regime that was committing genocide, the Holodomor, and suppressing politically entire groups and the entire population, killing millions of people, sending them to Siberia, manipulating elections. There were no actual elections worth this term. And the problem is, I think, the idea that it would be possible to have a supranational level of integration with such countries included. I think that's impossible, and that was already clear, even to a State Department research group. Joseph, you mentioned that State Department research group in I think in the first volume of your very valuable book on the history of world federalism, and I quoted that when they said, okay, a federal approach towards world order is not possible because the Soviet Union, amongst other reasons, would not agree to do away with the idea of sovereignty. Of course, that might have been an excuse because other countries wouldn't have wanted to do that either. But the point is that maybe it's possible temporarily to have a level of system of collective security with autocratic countries involved. And that is what the UN became, with the veto power established, of course. But I don't think, and I think it's quite obvious, that you can have a democratic body, an elected democratic body, with countries included that suppress their population, right? It's just doesn't fit. And if we were to speak of, I know we have a lot of world federalism, all here are world federalists. So if we talk of world federalism and supranational integration, we have to tackle the problem that this, what I mentioned before, the second wave of democratization has not completely succeeded. We are now in a phase of global autocratization, which even includes the United States today, which is massively on a path of autocratization. The VDEM report a week ago, that is assessing countries worldwide, is expecting that by summer, the United States can no longer be considered a democracy. If this continues at the pace it does. So why am I saying this? Because we can see this problem already in the post-World War II era, right? And by 1950 or so, that was off the table, global order reflections, because the Cold War, of course, set in. So enough. I'm sorry if I have elaborated too widely and too much, and I think I should now really zoom into chapter 27. But since you all read it, um, of course, as a book club, that does no harm, perhaps, if I move through chapter 27 a bit quicker. Chapter 27 is, I would characterize it, is a bit technical because it describes how an incremental development of a parliamentary body within the current system of the UN and the broader global governance environment could happen, how that incremental development could happen. And this is also not new. Those thoughts have been around for a long time. And of course, that is subject that is explained at a level of detail in the previous chapters of the book. So, of course, while we don't necessarily do that in this chapter 27, of course, it is, like I mentioned before, those reflections are embedded in the entire rationale and narrative of the book. So you would see, for instance, in chapter 5, which is which was the optional reading, you will see the relevant references to Louis Sohn and other authors who at the time already reflected on a parliamentary assembly based at that time, 1949, on the example of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which put together parliamentarians from the Council of Europe member states, for instance, etc., etc. So there's a lot that we are drawing on, and I'm just explaining this because this is not, chapter 27, the part where we are elaborating on all of these contexts in detail. That's in the book before. So one of the principal models and inspirations for the incremental development of a global parliament certainly is the development of the European Parliament. Those who I can see here today are probably many of you, if not most, are probably quite familiar with this narrative because you have come across it before in the context of the UN Parliamentary Assembly campaign, but still, let's have a look quickly at the milestones of European integration that appear to be particularly relevant. And first, it's interesting, and that is coming up also often in the practical work. It's interesting certainly to note that the European Union as it stands today developed over decades, right? And the first step was in 1952, the establishment of the European Community on Coal and Steel being, of course, key resources that are relevant for armament and in extension for warfare. And the idea was to put them in the common control as a part of, let's say, peacemaking and prevention, right? As a learning as a lesson learned from the war. And the European Community on Coal and Steel had a high authority, a court, to interpret acts of that high authority, but it had also, from the beginning, a common assembly of parliamentarians, national parliamentarians. And I'm not sure we can really go into so much detail as I was thinking, but so I will skip a little bit of detail. But the key point is that the European integration process later on with the Rome Treaty of 1957 involved the creation of two further communities, the European Economic Community and Euratom, which was then common control of atomic energy and research. Well, and those three communities for a long time were at first legally separate. However, interesting to see that the parliamentary body, the Common Assembly, first established in 1952, it was kept as quite literally a common assembly for these three communities. There were not three separate parliamentary bodies for the three European communities, but one, a joint assembly, in fact. And that's interesting insofar as that we have today, and that's part of the elaboration of chapter 27, as you know, a very complex and fragmented system of global governance with 36, nobody can really count them properly, entities of the UN system. We have entities outside the UN system, like the international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, and when we have the World Trade Organization as well, etc., etc. So, and countless treaty institutions and treaty bodies, etc. And this is inspiring to see how there was one joint assembly for the European communities at that time, because I think, and that's what we are arguing also in the book, in chapter 27 in particular, that this is something we should pursue, right? Certainly, a parliamentary assembly of the UN could start somewhere in the system. I mean, we argue it should start in the center, attached to the General Assembly, but it could just as well be attached, let's say, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? Or it could be attached, whatever, to the World Trade Organization. You know, there are many parts in the system where it could be attached at first. But the key point is really that the aspiration and the idea should be that we are not establishing a parliamentary assembly on world trade, but we are establishing a UN parliamentary assembly that would at first focus on world trade, just to stick to that example. This might seem semantic, but it's a key difference, right? Because what we want to do is really, we want to have a joint assembly for the entire global governance system. And that would address many problems in the system, one of which is, of course, fragmentation. So it's not just about democratic legitimacy and building that in order to move towards a system of actual decision making that goes beyond intergovernmental treaty making and ratifications, right? I mean, that's the point, of course, of a world parliament, ultimately, and that's described in chapter 27. The point is, of course, that we want to have a legitimate and elected body in a two-chamber system with a General Assembly. I mentioned that before. I mean, the successor body of the General Assembly probably that has sufficient legitimacy, inclusion, and representativeness that under certain rules, and I think we will talk about them in the next session of the book club, that under certain conditions and rules can actually adopt world law, binding world law. That's this long vision, you know, of world federalists and others over the centuries, of course. That's the point. And moving there also, again, can be inspired by the European example. There are other examples. I mean, like the Pan-African Parliament, etc. But international parliamentary institutions overall, they have faced challenges and issues a lot, in particular last 15 years. In the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, we can see a real upshoot of international parliamentary institutions across the world. Many, in the world regions, at the sub-regional level, and the development has stalled. Like the Pan-African Parliament originally was established as a body of the African Union that was supposed to have also legislative competence, but by now I think it is fair to say that at least some forces in the African Union, they are deliberately undermining the development of the Pan-African Parliament because they don't want that and they don't want an oversight body. So I'm just saying this because Europe, we are looking at Europe in particular because there it is most developed. The European Parliament by now is a co-legislative body. It is more powerful and more influential than any national parliament of the European Union member states. So that is quite interesting. And the European Parliament also, it became then directly elected in 1979. At first, it was, as you know, in the shape of that Common Assembly, indirectly elected through the national parliaments. And in that process, the European Court of Justice already in 1964 had a ruling that was setting the the tone insofar as that it determined that European law would have precedence over national law. So there was already a very, a deepening process of integration going on legally even, which means that there was also a need, a demand for increasing the democratic legitimacy of that process. And that was achieved through the parliamentary body, amongst other things. And in the process, the European Parliament, what became the European Parliament then at the latest in 1979, also played a role in moving that process forward. And that is, again, an interesting inspiration. For instance, in the early 1980s, Altiero Spinelli, who was a federalist in the European Parliament, as a member of the European Parliament, together with other progressive parliamentarians, they worked then on a draft European constitution. And this draft constitution was also, proposing to do away with unanimous decision making. So in fact, then in the 80s, the European Union, it was still the EEC at the time anyway. In the 90s, then it was merged into one legal entity. But in any event, there was then a process to move away from unanimity. And that is also one of the key problems for sure in the global governance system, in the intergovernmental order, where you have the need for any country, to agree to, of course, to treaties that it is bound by. And if we move towards a system of world law, we would have ideally at some point a qualified decision making, and no vetoes for single countries in any event. So a parliamentary assembly is envisaged as an engine for global transformation in this sense. From a world federalist perspective, the body would include the best allies of a process of global integration. It would also be a body, but that's touched on in a different chapter. I need to stick on our chapter at hand today, or at least attempt to. It is also a body that would support national democratization, as it would include parliamentarians from nation states, and it is not a body that would include representatives, or at least in theory, include representatives of the executive branches. They would continue to be represented in all the other intergovernmental bodies and the General Assembly, and then later the successor body of the General Assembly, whereas in the Parliamentary Assembly, that's the point, a larger spectrum of political representation and other forms of representation is to be achieved. And this means that minorities and opposition would be there as well. It does, in fact, connect a bit to chapter 27 because we do have there a subsection on transnational political groups, which are a key characteristic that is necessary for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. Without that, we would have to oppose any such step of establishing a parliamentary body, because transnational political groups are the procedural mechanism and the political mechanism to make sure that parliamentarians in this new body would work across nation states together based on their overall ideological and political outlook on the world and issues, right? So again, there is the European Parliament as an example, where we have those transnational groups of different kinds: conservative, green, socialist, left, etc., radical right also. And those groups work together across national boundaries, and they are presenting and working on solutions, drafts, policy, and laws from a European perspective, ultimately. So, for instance, the German members of the European Parliament, they are dispersed across the political groups in the parliament that are attached to their party, to their political party. They are not in the European Parliament. That's not even the official purpose, to advance what they might think are German positions, right? They would advance green positions or conservative positions. Of course, informed, that is obvious, informed by their particular origin and all that, that is clear. But the dynamics is entirely different, I would argue, than you would have it in bodies that are based on national delegations and geopolitical groupings. That is a key that is also mentioned in this chapter. Over time, the idea is, and we have seen this in the case of the European Parliament, over time, the democratic legitimacy of the body, of the parliamentary body at the UN, would have to increase and grow. This is connected, and that's elaborated in a different chapter, that is connected clearly, and I elaborated on that already, to the process of democratization at the nation state level. That is this big, big challenge, right? Unless countries themselves democratize or remain democracies, the process of global democratization is also under threat, I would say. So this is interconnected. Only when at some point in the future, and I'm sure it will come, we just don't know how and when maybe, but at some point in the future, all major countries in the world will allow for free and fair elections, competitive elections, and freedom and liberties will be granted. And at that stage, then we will actually be able to have a democratically elected world parliament, which would then have the degree of democratic legitimacy to have actual powers of decision making, binding decision making. But before that, we caution such ideas, if it is really doable. So there is also a subsection on the apportionment of seats in this chapter. I'm not sure we want to go into those technical details. However, maybe just there are two models that are mentioned. I don't think we need to go into that, but we can at least identify some of the principles. So we have we envision this process of increasing the democratic legitimacy of the assembly. This has to do first with the mode of the election, which means at first, like in the European case, national parliamentarians could be voted into the Parliamentary Assembly of the UN. But we also argue that from the beginning, states who want to do that, they could opt for direct elections. So we envision that over time we would have a hybrid assembly. Hybrid in the sense that the members of the assembly would have, there would be different methods to get them selected or elected. Some would be directly elected. The directly elected ones in a hybrid assembly would be the ones, they might perceive themselves as being the real ones, right? Those that are, they have the real democratic legitimacy. So we think, through that approach, maybe there will also be some pull into the direction of direct elections in connection with democratization in certain countries. Well, that is the one part, the mode of election, but also there are others that play a big role, which is the allocation of seats in particular. And here we suggest for you, all of you might have heard that a lot before, but this principle of digressive proportionality. Of course, according to democratic theory, one person, one vote is the ultimate goal. But before we get there, there would have to be a balanced approach that balances the different weight of countries in the world. You have to keep in mind, and that's perhaps my final comment. You have to keep in mind that the world's population is distributed across the world's countries in very unequal ways, right? So half of the world's countries, those supposedly sovereign states according to international law, they only make up 3.4% of the world's population, right? Whereas we have India and China, who together make up today like 35 or 36%. And this unwieldy relation, between mini-states, micro-states, and the biggest ones, that has to be put into a balance in a proper system of allocation of seats. So that's enough, I guess, for introductory comments. Thank you very much for listening. I know, in the chapters we have chosen, 27, it's really a bit technical, but I hope you still enjoyed listening.